Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. Of Mice and Men. By John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck's classic novella Of Mice and Men was released in 1937. The novella's world is based on the author's actual experiences as a farmhand in the 1920s, and the title is inspired from Robert Burns' poem To a Mouse, which states, "The best laid schemes of mice and men often go wrong." Of Mice and Men is regarded as an American classic and is frequently assigned reading in schools. The principal themes of the film are the impossibility of reaching the American ideal and the impenetrability of male friendships. The world in which the people live is beautifully depicted by Steinbeck and made relatable, despite the fact that the challenges they face are possibly more complex than most of us have to deal with. George Milton and Lenny Small are two poor plantation workers struggling to make ends meet in 1930s America during the Great Depression. From the beginning, it is evident that Lenny, a loping behemoth of a man, has a mental impairment and that George, smaller and more wiry, is not only his friend but also a guardian. Although Lenny's disabilities and failings appear to irritate George greatly. The two guys are on their way to a new ranch in another section of California when the narrative begins. However, the bus driver who was supposed to transport them there put them off in the wrong location, and they now have quite a distance to travel before they arrive. The men talk about their ambition of owning their own farm where they can raise food, animals, and keep rabbits while they stroll. Lenny is especially interested in the rabbits since he enjoys caressing soft things. But Lenny's fondness for soft things has gotten him in trouble before. We learn that he has a history of breaking little creatures in an attempt to show them affection since he is unaware of his own power. We also hear that Lenny once stroked the fabric of a girl's dress and wouldn't let go. As a result, the people of Wheat assumed he'd abused the girl and drove him and George out of town. George and Lenny decide to camp in a clearing for the night and have a bean supper, after which George advises Lenny that if something goes wrong while working at the ranch, he should return to that clearing and hide in the bushes until George comes to find him. The next day, the two guys arrive at the ranch and are greeted by Candy, an elderly handyman with only one hand and a very old, half-blind sheepdog in whom he takes great care. Candy takes them on a tour of the bunkhouse where they'll be staying. When George inquires about their boss, Candy responds that, while he was irritated by their late arrival, he is a decent man overall. Soon after, the boss enters and inquires about the men's tardiness. George tells the account of how the bus driver dropped them off at the wrong location. The employer notices George's habit of speaking for Lenny and questions him about it. George lies, telling him that Lenny is a relative who was kicked in the head by a horse when he was little and that, because he is family, George feels obligated to watch out for him. The boss seemed relieved but skeptical. He places the two guys under the supervision of Slim. Curly arrives just after the boss departs with his son. Curly is a former boxer and a very tiny man who clearly believes he has something to prove to the world. Curly begins bugging Lenny immediately, detecting inferior prey and demanding that the big guy talk. Candy informs George that Curly has a prejudice of huge men due to his tiny size, and that his fury has only worsened since he married a woman who likes to flirt with the ranch hands. Curly's wife appears, as if called, and flirts with both of the guys. She inquires about her husband's whereabouts, and George informs her that he has just departed. After she goes, Lenny remarks on how pretty he finds her, and George warns him to keep away from her. Lenny is taken aback by George's sudden shift of attitude, but accepts. Slim later introduces himself to the men, who are impressed by his quiet demeanor and the clear respect the other men have for him. Slim inquires about the puppies that his sheepdog has recently given birth to, and Lenny becomes ecstatic at the possibility of having puppies around. Dinner is served outside the bunkhouse. George runs into Curly again and fears that he may tangle with him at some time. Slim promises to give Lenny one of the sheepdog's puppies at the end of their work week. George thanks him and tells him that Lenny will take care of it and that, while he is stupid as hell, he is not nasty or crazy. George secretly tells Slim the narrative of how he came to be Lenny's caregiver in the first place. George and Lenny were born in the same town, and after Lenny's Aunt Clara died, George took care of him. He admits to Slim that he used to treat Lenny horribly and would persuade him to perform ridiculous or even dangerous things for his own amusement. But after pushing Lenny to jump into a river and nearly drowning him, George felt so guilty of his treatment of Lenny that he changed his ways and began defending him instead. George was the one who beat Lenny over the head to get him to release go of the girl whose dress he had been clutching before they were ejected out of Weed, and George afterwards helped Lenny hide in a ditch to escape the lynch mob when the girl accused him of rape. Candy and another ranch laborer named Carlson appear soon after. Carlson is upset with Candy's sheepdog, claiming that it stinks and is old and unhealthy. Carlson believes it should be put out of its suffering by being taken outside and shot. He offers to do this as well as bury it, and Candy ultimately agrees after some hesitation. Carlson leads the dog outside, and the guys hear a gun ring out after a few moments of silence. Candy is so upset that all he can do is turn and face the bunkhouse wall. Later on, the men play cards and discuss Curly's wife. They are positive that she will create trouble for one of the men at some point. Curly breaks into the bunker, seemingly on purpose, and wants to know where his wife is. He inquires as to the whereabouts of Slim. The guys inform him that Slim is in the barn, and two of the ranch hands accompany him out there in the hopes of seeing a fight. George inquires of Lenny, who was just in the bar caring to the puppies, if he saw Slim with Curly's wife. Lenny affirms that he did not, and then asks George to retell his favorite narrative, the description of the land they are about to purchase. Candy becomes intrigued by the description and asks George if they have a location in mind. According to George, they do. Candy informs them that he believes the ranch may let him go soon due to his advanced age and begs if he could live on their farm with them if he donates his life savings to the purchase. After some consideration, George and Lenny agree that he can accompany them and that by pooling their 3 wages, they will only need a month of labor on the ranch to afford to buy the land. George warns the 2 men to keep their scheme to themselves. Curly apologizes to Slim for thinking him of sleeping with his wife as the other men return from the barn. But Curly is still irritated by the men taunting him, and knowing that Slim is too fit for him to beat in a fight, he decides to vent his rage on Lenny instead. Curly strikes Lenny, and George, who cannot intervene for fear of getting fired, encourages Lenny to fight back. Lenny effortlessly breaks the smaller man's hand. Slim warns Curly not to fire Lenny and George because it will make him the ranch's laughingstock. Curly hesitantly concurs. The next evening, Lenny breaks his pledge to George and tells Crooks, another ranch hand named after his crooked back, about the secret property. Crooks doesn't believe him, claiming that he has heard countless ranch hands tell him the same story, and that a small plot of land is as difficult to come by for men living in these conditions as paradise. Crooks recalls his upbringing, when his family was the county's sole black family. He tells Lenny that he was told not to play with white children and that he has since hated the societal rules that separate black and white youngsters. One of these constraints is that Crooks must sleep in a different portion of the ranch from the other agricultural employees, an old stable. Candy appears and pays Crooks a visit for the first time in all of their years of collaboration. There is an uneasy undercurrent, but the men quickly warm to each other's presence, and Crooks adores having visitors. Candy informs Lenny that he has been thinking about it and may know of a method for their farm to profit from the bunnies that Lenny so urgently wants to keep. Crooks is skeptical of their proposal until Candy informs him that they have already chosen a farm and plan to go there in a month. This piques Crooks' interest, and he asks whether they'd consider taking him with them. Curly's wife enters before they can respond, inquiring about her husband's movements and then revealing that she knows he took a number of the ranch hands to a brothel. She angrily implies that he abandoned the 3 of them because they are frail. The guys advise her to go and explain that even if she does get them fired, they can easily go out and get their own place. Curly's wife begins talking about her troubled marriage and reveals that she craves company so badly that she went so far as to seek it out, despite how pathetic she feels. Crooks becomes enraged when she makes fun of Lenny's dispute with her husband, and she is asked to leave again. He promises to inform the boss, Curly's father, of her transgressions. She asks him whether he has any idea what she could do to him if he did tell on her, implying that she would lynch him. This frightens Crooks, and he retreats. Curly's wife soon hears the other guys returning and departs nonetheless, telling Lenny that she's delighted he beat up her husband. Candy is chastised by George for informing Crooks about their farm. Crooks claims that he has changed his mind about accompanying them to the farm and that he wouldn't want to go anywhere like that. Lenny is sitting in the barn on Sunday, stroking the dog that has died. It's clear that he crushed it by accident after showing too much affection, as he did with the other animals in his youth. Lenny is concerned about George's reaction when he learns that the dog has died. He is concerned that George would change his mind about allowing him to care for the rabbits on their farm, but then he wonders whether George doesn't care about the puppy's death because he wasn't that invested in the dog in the first place. Curly's wife enters and takes a seat next to Lenny. She comforts him at the puppy's death and assures him that it is safe for them to converse, despite George's warning not to speak to her. She tells Lenny about her life and how lonely and unhappy she is in her marriage to Curly, whom she despises. Lenny tells her about his soft things addiction, and she agrees to let him stroke her hair. She warns him to be gentle, but he becomes overly eager and clutches onto it, scaring her. She yells, but Lenny panics and covers her mouth with his hand. She tries to flee, but Lenny, in another example of not knowing his own strength, tries to grasp her too tightly and accidentally snaps her neck. Panicky, Lenny attempts to bury Curly's wife in the hay, like he had done with the dead puppy. When that fails, he flees with the dead dog in his hand, fearful that George will be upset with him. Candy arrives in search of Lenny and discovers Curly's wife's body. He summons George, who soon realizes what has occurred. George hopes that Lenny would be imprisoned but still cared for, but Candy contradicts him, informing him that Curly will set out to have Lenny hung. Candy asks George if the two of them can still buy the farm, and George informs him that without Lenny, he doesn't see it happening. He admits that he never imagined they'd be able to buy the property, but because Lenny was so committed in the idea, he'd just begun to believe it himself. George instructs Candy to inform the other men about the body, but not that he is aware of it, lest the other men suspect him of being involved in Lenny's murder. Candy obeys, and the other guys assemble in the barn to examine the body. In keeping with his strategy, George arrives last and looks astonished to see the body. Curly is furious and demands that the men create a lynch mob to track down and murder Lenny. Carlson's gun is quickly discovered to be missing, so Curly takes up Crook's shotgun to lead the mob instead. Lenny is waiting in the bushes in the story's opening clearing, as George instructed, and congratulates himself on remembering to go there to wait. While waiting, Lenny has visions of his Aunt Clara, who talks in his own voice and tells him not to listen to George and get himself into more trouble. Lenny also has a vision of a big rabbit telling him that George will most likely beat and forsake him. Soon after, George appears, unhappy and plainly devastated by his friend's deeds. Lenny offers to go live in a cave, as he always does when George is upset, and George begs him to stay, giving Lenny hope that he isn't upset. Lenny requests that George tell him the story of the farm once more, and as he does so, George requests that Lenny remove his hat and gaze across the river. Lenny, clearly unhappy, demands that they go to the farm right away after George tells him about the bunnies and how no one will ever be rude to him again. George accepts and pulls Carlson's revolver from his jacket, which he had grabbed and hidden. He shoots Lenny in the head and throws away the gun. The sound of the gunfire draws the other guys to the clearing, and George informs them that he spotted Lenny and grabbed the rifle away from him, accidentally shooting him. Slim is the only one who knows the truth, and he convinces George that he did the right thing. Slim brings George back to the ranch, leaving Carlson and Curly perplexed as to why they're so agitated. George Milton, the more intelligent of the two major characters, George took on the role of Lenny's guardian years ago after feeling embarrassed of mistreating him in the past. He is still a short-tempered man, but he is ultimately good-hearted and has a fraternal affection for Lenny. He appears to love telling Lenny about their future farm, and admits that he began to believe it for a time. Lenny Small, a mentally challenged guy with exceptional physical strength, Lenny evolves very little throughout the novella and arrives at the end, and his death, very much the same as he did at the start. We're led to assume from the start that Lenny is dangerous, despite his good intentions, and this is confirmed at the end when he accidentally kills Curly's wife in the barn. Above all, Lenny is an optimist and a dreamer, and he is appalled by his mistake in killing the woman. Candy, an older, one-handed ranch worker who is concerned about being laid off because of his age. Candy agrees to let Carlson put his dog down after convincing him that it is elderly and suffering, and then tells George that he wishes he had shot the dog himself because it was his problem to deal with and he thought he owed the dog that much. This is later symbolically mirrored by George shooting Lenny rather than allowing Curly to do it. Curly is a short man with a Napoleon complex who is constantly on the lookout for a battle. Curly is cruel, and as the boss's son, he wields considerable power over the ranchmen's fates. He is envious of other guys talking to his wife, despite the fact that he does not appear to be sad when she is killed. Curly's pursuit of Lenny is ultimately motivated by preserving his own dignity rather than avenging the murderer of his wife. Curly's wife, a pretty, dumb, nasal woman who is also narcissistic and downright mean. Curly's wife is never given an actual name in the novel, which diminishes her significance as the major character who pulls the resolve forward. She is conceited and clearly sees herself as a temptress for the ranch's males. She especially seeks out Lenny because she believes he is a vulnerable victim for her manipulation. However, she reveals multiple times throughout the novel that she is lonely and miserable, and that she despises her husband. Crooks is the only black worker on the land, and he is treated the worst of all the ranch hands. When Lenny first approaches Crooks in his stable, he turns him down, explaining that if he isn't permitted in the white man's house, they won't be allowed in his. But, in the end, his need for company triumphs, and he lets Lenny stay. Although Crooks appears nice at first, he is revealed to be a disillusioned character who, like Curly's wife, has allowed his own brutal treatment to influence how he treats others. He jokes with Lenny about George getting harmed in town and never returning. Crooks' curiosity in the farm, as well as the bashful way he inquires about it, reveal him to be a character who hides his own vulnerabilities beneath meanness and bluster. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.